So, hello everyone. My name is Gabriel Soto, Senior Director at Edison Research.
Hi, Gabe. I'm Bob Baird, COO here at Audiochuck.
Bob, we're here at Audiochuck Studios. So, thank you very much for the invite. I got to
Thank you
say,
for making the trip.
of course. So, I feel really inspired and ready to go over the latest research in true crime consumption, just being here at the home of, some of the best true crime storytelling in the world. Can you call out some of the podcasts that you and your team work on? What are you behind?
Absolutely. There's so many of them, right? The flagship is obviously Crime Junkie. Crime Junkie is the center here for us. And we've also got The Deck. The Deck Investigates.
Good one.
Dark Down East. Yeah, I think now we've got maybe 21 podcasts that are on the network.
Perfect. Yeah, so some of the best storytelling in true crime, in my opinion. So I'm happy to be here. But before we get started, I think folks who were in the waiting room prior to the start of this webinar deserve to know who that dog was.
That dog is the beloved Chuck. Chuck is Ashley's dog, and he's been here since the very beginning. He puts the Chuck in Audiochuck.
So Audiochuck is actually named after Chuck.
Yes, sir.
Wow, that's awesome. I knew it. I knew it.
He is our mascot. He's fantastic.
Yeah, and I love all the pictures around. One day I need the tour from Chuck myself. Well, thanks, Chuck, for the tour. Viewers, if you want to comment on how adorable Chuck is, you can do so in the chat function of your Zoom app. You can also tell us where you're from, how you're doing in the chat function. But if you have any questions, please use the Q&A box. We have members of the Edison Research team locked and loaded, ready to answer any questions about the data, findings, or methodology. Today, Bob and I will discuss and release new findings from the first of its kind true crime consumer report we conducted thanks to Audiochuck. So thank you, Bob. When we first brainstormed this research, you had a particular question in mind.
And that question was a simple one. Where do we go find more listeners?
Exactly. And we found ways, right? We have data to show how to bring true crime fans to the medium. And we're going to cover that in today's webinar. But what we found was so much more. True crime has affected podcasting. I don't think anyone can deny that. For example, many people were first introduced to podcasting by a true crime show. But in return, podcasting is transforming true crime, helping to solve cases, bringing in donations for nonprofits at a higher rate. It's a movement that listeners associate with not just their favorite host, but advertisers on these shows as well. Now, we collected data to show for this throughout this webinar, and this is how we did it. In May of 2024, we conducted over 3,100 online interviews with Americans 13 and older. That's a robust sample size in survey research. The results were weighted to match the gender, age, and ethnicity of the U.S. population. We also spoke with 24 true crime consumers through in-depth interviews. You'll see videos of these interviews throughout this report.
Yeah, and the videos I love. Like I'm all about the data. The data is fantastic and it tells a story in and of itself. But to get to the videos and to see some of the people that are behind the numbers, that adds depth to this.
Exactly. Let's show a preview of one of these right now.
True crime coverage is important because people deserve the truth.
People deserve to be informed about the world around them.
It gives you the true story, the real story.
It keeps you up to breath with what's going on. It just makes you aware and keeps you vigilant.
I think it's just helpful to not only tell the stories of other people that have suffered, but also to have it be like, these are what to look for in terms of like not letting this happen again.
Because it's good to hear victim stories and have them felt like they're being heard.
It gets people out there, makes them aware of what's going on in the world. That stuff actually does happen. That it's not all, rainbows and sunshine.
That it lets the people know that sometimes the justice system fails, that there is sometimes no justice.
I think it makes me more aware of like my surroundings and like situations that I put myself in.
it's definitely a good way to keep your eye open, to be aware and to know that the world's okay, but crazy things can happen. So I think it's just a good way to keep yourself in check with reality.
There are bad people out there. And I feel like you have to know what's possible, like the possible dangers in order to protect yourself.
It gets people out of their comfort zone and exposes them to horrific things.
It leads to everyone questioning their own existence in the balance of like good and evil. When you're shocked in this way, it's kind of like cold water therapy for like your subconscious. You're like, whoa.
That's good.
Yeah. And that's just a couple reasons why true crime consumers think the genre is important. And we'll see more of them later on. And we'll also talk about the importance of true crime later on. But Bob, to answer the question that you had, how has true crime affected podcasting? We have to rewind a decade. When we look back at the milestones that led to podcast adoption in the U.S., we can't overlook 2014. Bob, I don't know what you were doing in 2014, but I hadn't even heard of the word podcast.
2014 was a long time ago, and surprisingly, I had heard of podcasts. I was in the tech scene back then, right? Like I was in application development, and a lot of the tech information that started out with podcasting. That was kind of where the early adopters sat.
Okay, so at the time it was emerging.
Yeah.
And at the time, according to the Infinite Dial, when you were still coding, when you were still working in software, 30% of the U.S. population had ever listened to a podcast at one point in their lives. That year, a show you might be familiar with, Serial, released its first episode.
Serial, yep. I remember that well.
Yep. Now, I don't know if you know this, but The Real Life Murder Mystery was the first show to reach 5 million downloads. That's an audience size, comparable to what many hit cable TV shows accumulate in an entire season. The show often gets credited as that spark that ignited the boom in podcast listening. That boom today in 2024 has reached 192 million Americans who have ever listened to a podcast. Serial introduced many people to the medium, and it set the tone for true crime to do that today. The genre is the third most listened to podcast genre in the States. Its podcasts draw in 1 in 5 weekly podcast consumers each week, according to our study, Edison Podcast Metrics. Part of the reason is because true crime podcasts do such a great job of maintaining listeners' attention. In that same study, podcast consumers who listen to true crime each week are far more likely than the average podcast listener to binge a podcast or listen to multiple episodes in one session. So true crime podcast consumers are the second most likely to binge out of listeners to any other genre tagged in Apple Podcast taxonomy.
Yep. And I'm going to give people a peek behind the scenes of the research that you did. What you shared back with us is that so many of these people said that they found true crime to be fascinating. And I thought that word was fascinating. That's not a commonplace word for us. We don't hear that often. So I started kind of digging into what they might have meant by that. And I think some of the essence of what was captured in there was that they were intellectually pursuing and emotionally pursuing a story. Podcasting is a very intimate medium, and now you have people that are like very engaged in what it is that they're listening to. And I think that's where you get such high listen through on true crime. I think that's why you see that we're as far up the list on binging as we are.
Yeah. People are almost like borderline obsessed with the story. They want to keep going. That's another reason why they're some of the most popular shows, right? These true crime podcasts. For example, Crime Junkie has the second largest U.S. weekly audience out of any podcast available in the States. Dateline ranks in 5th. Morbid rounds out the top 10. With the role that these true crime podcasts have played in bringing in listeners to the medium, we have to answer your other question, Bob. How can we continue to bring true crime consumers to podcasts? What are the growth opportunities? Well, let's start by setting the stage here. Today, 84% of the U.S. population watch or listen to true crime through any medium. That's television, that's YouTube, social media, or podcasting, which translates to 230 million consumers.
230 million consumers. It's hard to wrap your head around how many people that is. You're sitting with us in the middle of Indianapolis, Indiana, beautiful city. About 2.3, 2.5 million residents in the MSA, right? You would have to take 100 of these cities and smush them together to represent the size of our listening audience.
Fun fact for you. Did you know that if you stuck true crime consumers on its own island, just a nation on its own, it would be the 6th most populated country in the world?
I love that.
That's how big true crime is. It's a huge market. True crime, true crime, true crime. How many times do you think we've said true crime already?
860.
860. And we'll say it 860 more. That begs the question, what does true crime even mean? Well, we will let consumers explain that for themselves. Take a look at this video.
To me, my understanding of true crime is any crime that's actually happened and you can document it in some form. Sometimes it takes the form of a docuseries, sometimes it's a podcast, sometimes it's a written work.
So I immediately think about like investigations. That's primarily what I think about when I am like associating true crime with something.
True crime basically is a story of evidence of all these little blocks. You're putting them together and you're trying to build a narrative.
Brief in and out of like a murder, a tragedy, basically. And I think of it as being presented to me in documentary format generally.
I would say like any media that's based on a crime that really happened.
It's typically like a focus on like violent crime, but it's like real people and like cases.
Anything that involves murder.
How people's lives were lived and how it was just taken from them.
My understanding of it is, I mean, like a crime, a legal crime that is committed that happened in real life.
Actual cases of crimes that have happened.
Any sort of crime that happened, that's factual, and that kind of is based off of what actually happened, not some fantasized version.
But then you could also dramatize it. I mean, I did watch the Staircase documentary series, and then I watched the dramatization. So I would say that would also be considered true crime.
So what I notice is that there's diversity in the way people think of true crime, and that extends to the type of content within true crime that they consume. Murder cases and serial killers, those are the most alluring topics in the genre. 2/3 of current true crime consumers have an interest in murder, while 60% choose content involving serial killers. Now, other noteworthy topics are cold cases, unexplained mysteries, missing persons, local crimes, and my favorite line of storytelling, survival stories. These topics punch above their weight in the current landscape. They each draw in over half of true crime consumers.
Yeah, and here at Audiochuck, we have stories that represent all of those topics, right? Even the supernatural. So supernatural, we just dropped unexplained mysteries. I mean, that went right to #1 in a matter of a day or two. People really, they just eat this stuff up. And it's important for us to remember why we deliver this. Right. So each of those things you just outlined, like they're dark. There are dark things there, but it's important for us to remember that there are victims at the center of all of this. So the content that we choose to ensure that we can educate our listeners and to keep those victim stories going. Right. There's a strong line of advocacy through what we pick.
Yeah, and we'll touch on that very topic, victim-centered, victim stories, right, and advocacy towards the end of this webinar. So great point there. Where they're consuming this content is also important to understand. We have to set the stage here. By far, the most popular method was television. 68% of true crime consumers use TV or movies to tune into true crime content. 7% of consumers turn to YouTube, 29% to social media, and 22% to podcasts. fans are consuming true crime in so many other places. So how can we bring these people to podcasting? How can we make podcasts maybe one day the most preferred medium for true crime? Well, one group or persons of interest that can help us answer that question are the true crime consumers who do listen to podcasts but do not listen to true crime podcasts. That's a profile that applies to an estimated 48 million Americans. We asked them, what can get you to take that last step? What can get you to listen to a true crime podcast? Well, we tested different characteristics of true crime podcasts that might interest them. Stories from their local region were the most popular. So, Bob, I like to say that, in this age of information, you have TikTok, you have videos coming at you, you have social media and video games, right? Location, this age of information, location is an effective way to draw someone's attention. That's when you hear someone mention the name of the city you grew up in or the city you have a special connection to. On the other side of the room, you quickly, turn your head. Or it's a great way to also build connection. When you meet someone for the first time, you often start off by asking them, where are you from, right? Location. This segment of podcast non-listeners is also attracted to stories involving high-profile cases. Many would also listen for the psychology behind criminal events, and over a third say true crime coverage with perspectives of the victims would also draw them to the medium, and 36% say investigative reporting. Bob, do any of these stand out to you?
They almost all stand out to me, right? There's so many things I can take away from this. Let's start with location. I think location's super interesting. When you say that, in my mind, I see Kylie Lowe, and I think about Dark Down East, right? She's built her entire show around being location specific. I also think about Delia in Counterclock. Each of those seasons is hyper-focused on a particular area where a case has occurred. I think what's really interesting about location, though, is I think there's actually a story behind it. Because when we break past location, I believe what people are saying is they're looking for community. I think it's that sense of community that allows people to gather around that. And in today's age, community can expand beyond location, right? And we've seen plenty of shows where when we get hyper-focused on a community, people rally around that.
Interesting. Yeah, so you're going that extra mile. You're building a community out of location, but it's also expanding beyond the region. Interesting. Yeah, so this is, again, one of the ways that we can convince these true crime consumers who don't listen to true crime podcasts to take that step into true crime podcast listening. To understand what draws people to true crime, let's look at what consumers like about the genre in this following video.
I like the build up and the climax of putting things together. The person who I like the sleuth.
I think in my second life, I would have liked to have been a detective.
I think I just love mystery, and I like watching people solve a mystery.
I think to kind of maybe solve it before they tell you.
While you're listening to it, you're trying to piece together who did it and why, and they're giving you the backstory to it.
It's psychological evaluation. It's, investigations, it's interrogations. That's a lot of what I like to watch is the interrogations of people, after, trying to figure out why they did the things that they did and how they did it.
Yeah, we saw many of those themes among the next segment of 119 million Americans who are true crime consumers who have ever listened to a true crime podcast. So these are people that have experience with the medium, the genre on the medium. So understanding the reasons this segment consumes true crime can help anyone appeal to a group that has already instilled podcasts into their routines or at least has some experience with the podcast medium. So we split reasons for listening into different themes. Suspense and mystery were the most notable. Half of true crime podcast listeners like the genre because of the suspense and thrill. Another half like solving the mysteries like we just heard.
I'm going to take you back to that word fascinating, right? Like I said earlier, I believe that word fascinating is implying this intellectual and emotional engagement. These aren't listeners that are just passively sitting there and, it's not okay if you tune out for 60 seconds. People will rewind. They'll go back and they'll cover that 60 seconds because you're engaged and you're trying to piece this story together. You want to beat the host to figuring out what's happened.
Yeah, people are just captivated, right? And it appeals to one of our core psychological values or functions as humans, the need to understand things. So does the following theme, education. Just under half of true crime podcast listeners like the psychology behind criminal events, 48% like the forensic science involved, and 37% want to learn how to be safe and protect themselves using lessons found within true crime stories.
Yeah, and that's one of the core tenets. When we put content together, it's advocacy first, and then it's education. Be weird, be rude, stay alive, right? The tagline exists. Additionally, when it comes from an education standpoint, you can really see where Ashley's made an impact. That the education has a huge impact in the real world. Ashley's done a lot of work through Season of Justice. Technology has advanced out there. And keeping our listeners educated on how that technology, forensics technology, can help solve these cases, that includes law enforcement, there's a real impact on that.
Interesting. That's a very good point. And that's a perfect segue into our final theme here, which is advocacy. Just under half of true crime podcast listeners say they're interested in the genre because it can help unsolved cases and share victim stories. And 44% say it helps deliver justice.
Yeah. Crime Junkie Nation is full of advocates. Like, our listeners are they love to take action. The petitions that we put out, we've seen hundreds of thousands of signatures. They donate. Like, they're very action-oriented listeners.
That brings us to our next point. How has podcasting affected true crime? Well, like Crime Junkies, it's transforming it. See, true crime podcast listeners are changing the justice system, and that's not an exaggeration. For example, at the bottom here, 22% of listeners have provided a tip or other information to help solve a case, compared with 5% of true crime consumers who have never listened to a podcast.
And I think that has to do with the medium. Podcasting is a very intimate, engaged medium, right? Like I had said earlier, when you're listening, if you miss 60 seconds, you rewind and you go back. You don't necessarily see that with a Netflix binge. It's okay to get up and go to the kitchen and miss a couple minutes. With podcasts, the host is in your ear and you're very tied to the story.
And many podcast listeners love to build that connection with those hosts.
That's right.
And do you also think that it's because some of these listeners are younger podcast listeners? It's a new format that younger consumers are taking on?
That could be. Yeah, that could be what we see. When you think about the demographic of where true crime is, you can still see podcasts emerging, right? I don't think it's the minority media because it's less favorable. I think it's just a newer technology, and that adoption is still coming up.
So just to summarize what we just talked about, those who listen to true crime podcasts are more than 4 times more likely to provide a tip or other information to help solve a case when compared to true crime consumers who do not listen to podcasts. True crime podcast listeners are more than 3 times more likely to sign a petition related to a crime case, and they're nearly twice as likely to promote an awareness of a case. And that's precisely what happened in 2021 when the podcast Crime Junkie covered the 1981 murder of a priest in a small town in Odessa, Texas. See, the person convicted of the murder was convicted with virtually no evidence tying him to the scene of the crime. And you can let me know if I get this story wrong, so I want to make sure I get it right. The 80s went by. The 90s went by. 40 years went by until a couple, Harley and Matt Girk, pictured on the left here, listened to that 2021 Crime Junkie episode on a road trip. Unsatisfied with how that story ended, they knew they had to do something. See, it turns out the couple was actually from that small town where the crime occurred, Odessa, Texas. It also turns out that Matt was the police chief's son. After suggesting to his father that he should look into the case again, they were able to test fingerprints found at the crime scene with new technology. With this, they were able to identify the real killers of the priest, and they exonerated the man who had been wrongfully convicted. His name is James Harry Rayos, pictured on your right.
Yeah, and let's talk about that moment in the office for a minute, and let's work that into the true crime genre. There's no denying that true crime podcasting is entertaining, right? There is entertainment to it, for sure. We try to make sure that that entertainment stays in the passenger seat, but on days like this, that entertainment moves to the back seat entirely, right? So it was a powerful moment. I mean, I still remember it vividly for us to be in our main conference room and for that notice to come through that this gentleman who had been wrongfully convicted for 40 years was just exonerated. He gets a final taste of freedom, right? Because of the hard work of the staff out here. And it really underscored and reinforced like why we drive on advocacy and why we drive on victim-centered crime the way that we do. Here's a case that had set cold for 40 years, and just by chance, two people on a road trip who happened to be related to the police chief listen and are unsatisfied, right? Because they are intellectually engaged with this content and take action. They turn into an advocate just like that.
It's interesting that you say that, because if the storytelling weren't so captivating, what if they never listened to the end of the story? How did you feel that on that day? You talked about how the office felt. How did you feel on that day?
I don't want to talk about me because I'm not the one who's deep in the work, right? Like I'm watching our producers and our EPs and the script writers and the fact checkers and the researchers. They're the ones who really pour their lifeblood into this work. And it was watching that emotion well up in them. And it wasn't a day. Like to this day, there's a good chance that we've got Brittany listening to this right now. And she's welling up right there, right? She's welling up out there as we talk about this. It's just such an emotional thing to know that when you come to work and you put all of this effort in, not only does it help the people that you're here just earning a living with every day, but it impacts a world out there that you can't even imagine.
Yeah. It gets you coming back.
It does.
To work, waking up every day.
It's an awesome why.
Yeah. For sure. So I wouldn't be wrong to say that podcasts and their listeners are serving up justice.
We have great listeners.
They're also donating at a higher rate than other true crime consumers. So podcast listeners, they are nearly 4 times more likely to donate money to a cause or organization, and more than 3 times more likely to donate directly to their victims or their families compared to true crime consumers who don't listen to podcasts. I think it's also inspiring to see, Bob, how Audiochuck on its own has contributed more than $8 million to nonprofit organizations.
Yeah, and honestly, this speaks to the core value of our organization, and that's planted there by Ashley, right? Ashley got into true crime because of everything we've been talking about, not because it was the thing that was cool on the scene or like this was the wave to ride. Ashley's always been interested in this, and she's done it from an advocacy standpoint, and she continues to do that today. She focuses her company on what we can do to help others, and she focuses our resources on what we can do to help others. And it's another one of those things where it's like it brings this other depth to work here that makes you appreciate the content in a way. I really do think that both podcasting and Audiochuck, we're leading the charge in changing the way that true crime is told.
Yeah. Transformation. Another way podcasting is changing true crime is by focusing more on the victim. Bob, what exactly is victim-centered true crime?
Yeah, victim-centered true crime is that transformation. It's the evolution that we're talking about, right? When you think back about the documentaries that we're all familiar with from the 80s to the early 2000s, they were sensational. It was borderline kind of horror movies. And as we're seeing this genre progress, and the thing that we're trying to do, we're trying to drag it into its evolution, where you remember at the center of every one of these stories is a victim, is a person, it's a human. Right, and this really grabbed me when Ashley went on tour last year. She covered the story of Darlene Halls, and Darlene was a murder victim with small children at home. This case was cold; it had been decades, and as we were unraveling the case, Darlene's family, one of her daughters, actually made her way into our office to meet with Ashley, and went to one of those shows while she was on tour. And it will force you. There is no way to tell a victim's story with a family member around to forget who's at the center of that story. And ever since that experience, when I listen, whether it's Audiochuck material or someone outside of our studios that's put true crime together, it's so hard for me not to think about the loved ones that the victims left behind and how they might be perceiving this content, right? And that's what we mean by ethical true crime. That's what we mean by victim-centered true crime.
Interesting. Just another microcosm of, what's behind that transformation in all this data that we see here in this report. So respondents saw a version of this definition that you just explained, right? And 77%, after being faced with that definition, said they would be more interested in consuming true crime content if it were victim-centered. Would you say listeners are also demanding this approach? It sounds like you're changing listeners' ways of consuming the content, but would you say listeners are also just demanding this approach in coverage? Are podcasters pursuing it and therefore, continuing to change this fabric of true crime?
Again, it's an evolution, which means that there's a swath of listeners who don't know. They're not educated about this, or they choose not to care about this. They're there primarily for the entertainment. That's fine. That's one thing. I think there's a different set of listeners that's propelling our show forward. And what I'm so interested in those listeners, and I think your statistics show that, we have highly motivated, action-oriented listeners. And that's amazing to me. We have people who want to take action and then want to have an impact on the world. And those are the listeners I want to find more of.
Mm-hmm. And people think true crime is important for these reasons. Mm-hmm. And I don't think anyone understands the importance of true crime more than crime junkies. 37 million Americans have ever listened to the podcast Crime Junkie. 74% of this group say the word important describes the genre very or somewhat well versus 54% of true crime consumers in general.
Yep. And I think that goes back to how Crime Junkie builds community, right? We understand. Crime Junkie Nation understands how what they listen to shapes how they think shapes how they act. And we're taking actions based around that.
Interesting. I think Crime Junkie also embodies the opportunities there are for true crime podcasts to grow, for this entire space to grow. I think we can show people a video of true crime consumers who had never listened to the show until we played them an audio clip as an example of this opportunity. Let's do it.
Got it.
She says, I can't say my name, but she does admit that Philip kidnapped her when she was just 11. And despite looking young, she's actually 29 now. Melanie is shocked when she hears this. And she asks again, what is your real name? But the woman says she hasn't said her real name in 18 years, and she can't bring herself to do it now. But she thinks she can write it down. So Officer Melanie gets her a pen and paper, and on that paper, the woman writes, J.C. Lee Dugard.
What were your overall thoughts of that clip?
Oh, I'm sucked in and I want to know more now.
Really liked it. It bring you in for sure.
I think it has a good conversational storytelling tone to it. I think it's easy to get sucked in there.
It just sucks you in.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like the way they kept you in suspense, and they were telling a good little story there.
When I get off, I'm gonna go Google it and go J.C. Dugard, what happened to her?
I'm a big fan of people who have very compelling voices, a very smooth sort of and that narrator definitely does. I would definitely want to hear them speak.
Well, she tells the story in such a way, and her voice is just really good and pleasing. I mean, that's a lot of it right there too. I mean, she's just easy to listen to.
She sounds pleasant, kind of like just a casual conversation.
Just her storytelling is great.
Oh, the lady's voice is so, her diction is good. Her meter, and she can pull things out and pop a word. Shocked. She's a good storyteller.
That's great. I hadn't seen that before. That's really cool to see them respond like that.
Yeah, a lot of captivating storytelling. And, that demonstrates this opportunity. We also asked this in our nationally representative study, and we found that 41% of true crime fans who do not listen to Crime Junkie would be likely to do so after hearing an audio clip. We also played them an audio clip in the survey. And that's a significant number. If you think about that, that's 112 million people. and that, Bob, embodies how many true crime consumers are willing to tune into a true crime podcast, right? The golden opportunity here.
Yeah, and that takes us back to the reason we asked you to do the study. Our concern, our question to you was, how do we go find new listeners? The concern buried in that question is that Crime Junkie has done well. It's been around for 7 years. It's been #1 true crime podcast for several of those years. It's gotten a lot of exposure. We were convinced that to see significant growth, we had to go find fans. We had to go find listeners who didn't yet know about podcasting. What your research taught us is that podcasting is bigger than any of us thought, right? According to the numbers that you've got here, 112 million people would be willing to listen to this show if they just heard Ashley telling stories more often. And this really, I think this is great news for anyone who's in podcasting, because it shows how much potential this industry still has. So much of what's left to do is just teach people what's out there. And as they learn, as they hear, they're going to come in.
Yep. Just helping them find the right content, right? The
That's
content
right.
that they like.
The content that's done well.
Exactly. Well, Bob, thanks for having me here at the studio, and thank you for sharing your wisdom today. There's a lot of data in the report. I think it's going to help a lot of people tell their own stories, talk about their own true crime show. Can you tell me one reason why you decided to, make this public, this report public?
Sure. I think, again, with podcasting being such a young industry, there's so much for us to learn from one another, and trying to understand how we teach one another and we help one another understand how to help the entire industry grow. That's the water level that raises for all boats, right? Like, we help ourselves by helping one another. And thank you for making the trip, and thank you for all the hard work you've done in this study. It was immensely valuable.
Of course. And thank you. Shout out to the Edison Research team back in New Jersey and wherever we have Edison people all over the place. So shout out to them. They worked hard on this report too. And shout out to the Audiochuck team who helped out a lot. Folks viewing the webinar, thanks for joining us today. You will find a summary of findings and the full report that we presented today when you download the full report on edisonresearch.com.
Awesome. Thanks again, Gabe.
Yep. Thank you, Bob.